Okay, so this is part 4 of the Introduction to Music textbook, Music and Appreciation. And we're going to pick up with chapter 10. And so for this last part of this unit, this part of the book, we're going to talk about these various composers, the important composers, most important composers of the day. There were many composers in Europe who were writing original music at this time, but many of them, most of them, are lost to history. There are some minor figures and there are some slightly more important figures, but the 3 composers whose music is the most loved, most performed from this period are Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven. So let's start with Haydn. So, Haydn was born in 1732, died in 1809. Lived a nice long life for the period, well into his 70s. He was from Austria. He moved to Vienna. He became choir boy in Vienna, which is where he got his initial musical training. Then his voice changed. He was a boy soprano, and when his voice changed, they threw him out of the church, said, sorry, you're done, threw him out of St. Stephen's Cathedral. He kicked around, he had some jobs, he studied, he learned, he trained, and then eventually he got signed on by the Esterházy family. The Esterházy family was this very wealthy and powerful Hungarian family that were so rich. I mean, well, first of all, their palace, Esterházy, was just an amazing building, many buildings, and massive grounds and lands and all of that stuff. So, Haydn's role was to be the music director. As music director, he was considered to be a skilled servant, kind of on par with the head chef, for example. He had to wear a uniform. He was not allowed to speak unless spoken to, all the things that servants had to deal with from the nobility at the time. Why would you take that job? Well, it paid well, it was prestigious, plus he had an orchestra that he could write music for, and they would perform it, and he had people that would listen to this music, which is what you ultimately want as a composer. He had to write a ton of music because the Esterházys wanted a lot of music for entertainment. Their palace had an opera house, had a theater, and had 2 separate concert halls. So in addition to a ton of chamber music that he had to write to entertain the members of the aristocracy and perform with members of the aristocracy, because some of them played instruments and they wanted to play music, and one of Haydn's jobs was to write music for them to play and to perform with them. As I said, these are the reasons why you would take that job. The benefits, the opportunity to compose music and have people perform it. Eventually, he left the service of the Esterházys, and for the last part of his life, he moved to London, and he became an international celebrity in London. That was actually all kind of triggered by a change in his employment status in 1779. This will not be on a test or anything, but I found it to be very interesting. Up to that point, any music he wrote was considered to be property of the Esterházy family. Just like, say, if you work for Microsoft and you write a program, even if you write it on your own, it's still the property of Microsoft. In 1779, Haydn was given permission to publish his music and sell it, and once he did that, he quickly became famous. And then eventually, in the 1790s, he moved to London, where he became an international celebrity. Haydn was a pioneering composer. He was called the father of the symphony and the father of the string quartet. He was very influential. Mozart and Beethoven, he and Mozart became good friends, even though Mozart was 24 years younger. They had a great mutual respect for each other. And Beethoven actually moved to Vienna to study with Haydn, and did study with Haydn. His music used folk songs and original music that was in the style of folk songs, as we talked about in the last lecture, that his music was appealing to the middle class. It's actually quite fascinating to me that Haydn is one of those composers, very few composers can say this, that the aristocracy loved his music, the performers loved to play his music, and the general public loved his music. Sometimes people would write very complex music to try to appeal to the upper class, and the general public didn't enjoy it. Or they might write, or the performers didn't enjoy playing it. But Haydn was 3 for 3. Everyone liked his music. I'm going to put in a link to the first movement. Now, you know what? I'll clarify this on Blackboard, but I think I'm actually going to put in the second movement of Haydn's symphony, the Surprise Symphony, just as a good listening example of Haydn. We've already listened to a little bit of Haydn in the last lecture. You were supposed to listen to Haydn's Trumpet Concerto. The next of these great composers is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart died when he was 35 years old. He was born in 1756, died in 1791. He was the child prodigy. He was the son of a musician, Leopold Mozart. There's a very famous painting of Wolfgang at the piano, his sister Maria Anna singing, and Leopold, their father, playing violin. He had them touring all over Europe. When he was 6 years old, Mozart was performing on harpsichord and violin and could improvise, was performing at a professional level. When he was 8 years old, he wrote his first symphony. As I said in the last lecture, symphony is kind of considered to be one of the real high points of what a composer aspires to do. Well, he wrote one when he was 8. When he was 11, he wrote an oratorio. If you remember from the Baroque period, oratorios were massive compositions. When he was 12 years old, he wrote an opera, which is probably the hardest thing that you can write as a classical composer, because you have to deal with text and voices and orchestra and how to write the music so it works within the staging and the scene and all that. So he toured up to age 15 all around Europe with his family, playing for kings and queens and even the Pope, and he was treated like a rock star. He was considered to be one of the greatest musicians, plus the fact that he was so young really made people interested in hearing his music. This led to some problems for him later. Because he was treated like a rock star when he was young, he was very dependent on his parents. He never really grew up in a lot of ways. I've heard some people liken Mozart to Michael Jackson in certain ways, in that he was a child star who, even when he became an adult, didn't really handle adulting all that well. After he was touring around, when he got into his mid-teens, he started work at the Archbishop's Court in Salzburg, the same place where his father worked, where he was treated like all the other musicians, like a servant. Well, he didn't like this. He'd been treated like a rock star for the last 10 years, and now he's being treated like a servant. So he left. He moved to Vienna when he was 25 years old and became a freelance musician, where he was basically entirely dependent on his own talents for his income, staging performances of his music, getting commissions where people paid him to write music for them, teaching lessons and things like that. He was originally very successful. He got married, Costanza. They had 2 children who lived to adulthood. In those days, infant mortality rates were very high. He had 2 sons who lived to be adults, neither one of whom had children. So there's no one in the world that can trace their lineage directly back to Mozart. You might be able to trace your lineage to Mozart through his sister, but there are no direct descendants of Mozart. He became friends with Haydn, as I mentioned before, but then his popularity fell off. Like everything else in those days, people wanted new. Mozart's music, once he'd been in Vienna for a while, people wanted to move on to the next thing. His music, while it was incredibly tuneful and easy to remember, it was also very complicated, and so for some people it went out of style. He lost students, he lost concert attendance. Towards the end of his life, he had a brief resurgence, brief resurrection in his popularity. His last opera, The Magic Flute, was very popular at the time. But he died at age 35. As I think I mentioned, they think he died of scarlet fever. He was buried in a mass grave, unmarked mass grave. No one knows where Mozart is buried to this day. The last thing he was writing was a Requiem Mass. A Requiem Mass is the Catholic Mass for the dead. He was commissioned to write this Mass by a guy who actually had planned to hold on to it until Mozart died and then pass it off as his own piece of music. But Mozart got even with him because Mozart died before he finished it, so the guy never got the music. It was eventually, it was finished by one of his students and is performed. Boy, so much. I've played with a lot of orchestras, I've played a lot of classical music over my 30-year professional career, and I think I've played Mozart's Requiem in the orchestra for that, more than any other piece of music that I've ever played. I've probably played his Requiem 10 times with 10 different groups. It's a very popular piece to do with choral societies. Mozart was staggeringly talented. He wrote music very quickly. He heard it in his head almost perfectly. You know, you look at the manuscripts of Mozart's music, the original things he was writing down, and there's not a lot of corrections to it. So he had this amazing talent and speed with which he would work. So even though he only lived to be 35, he wrote over 600 pieces of music. His music was all cataloged after his death by a guy named Kerschel, so it all actually has a K number. The last piece of music Mozart was working on, his Requiem, is K626. He wrote concertos. He wrote over 20 piano concertos, every one of which was written to feature him as a soloist. He also wrote concertos for violin. He wrote 4 French horn concertos, wrote a bassoon concerto, flute concerto. He wrote operas. He's considered to be maybe the greatest opera composer who ever lived. He wrote serious operas, he wrote comedy operas, he wrote operas that are kind of in between, that are at times serious and at times funny. Some of them are in Italian, some of them were in German, because by this period of time, you didn't have to write all of your operas in Italian anymore. People were beginning to write in the vernacular, which is common language for their area. Mozart later he was influenced by Haydn, he knew Haydn. He also became influenced by the music of Bach. I'm going to put a scene up from his opera Don Giovanni, which is one of the truly great operas that's ever been written. It's comic, but it's also serious. The opening scene that I'm going to play for you features Don Giovanni. Don Giovanni is Italian for Don Juan. Don Juan is a legendary Spanish nobleman who traveled around Europe seducing women. He was also the world's greatest sword fighter, so he would seduce the women, sometimes by force, which we call rape, and then whenever their husbands or their brothers or their fathers came after him, he would kill them in a duel. So this opening scene, we have Don Giovanni, is sung by baritone. We have Donna Anna, who is a young noblewoman who Don Giovanni has just seduced, and now he's leaving, and she's trying to not let him leave because he tells everyone, I love you, I'm going to stay with you, and then he bails, and sometimes they get very pissed off. As a matter of fact, sometimes, one character in the opera, he gets followed through most of the opera. The Commandant, or Commendatore, which is her father, is played, the role is a basso profundo, a very serious role. He gets killed in the opening scene by Don Giovanni, and Leporello, who is Don Giovanni's servant. He follows him, he has to go with him everywhere, he's employed by Don Giovanni, he's a member of the lower class, so he doesn't have any say over what they do. And he's sung by a bass, or type of character called a basso buffo, which is bass voice but very comedic role. All of these roles, well, with the exception of the Commandant, are sometimes funny and sometimes serious, which is something that Mozart was a genius at. So, in the opening scene, Don Giovanni seduces Donna Anna. Her father challenges Don Giovanni to a duel, and he kills him. So, this whole time Leporello is singing about how he's a servant and he'd love to be a nobleman. That's the opening scene. The plot of the opera is ultimately, we go through the entire opera with Don Giovanni traveling around, seducing women, sometimes being chased by people. And in the very final scene, the ghost of the Commandant comes back to Don Giovanni and drags him down into hell. So, or tells him to repent or you're going to hell. And of course, Don Giovanni does not repent. He's incapable of repenting. So, we're going to start with, oh no, we're not going to do the opening scene. I'm going to put a link to the opening scene because it's brilliant musically. He writes, at one point you have 4-part counterpoint going. It's really genius. But the link that they talk about in the book, or the scene they talk about in the book, is called the catalog aria. This is basically where Leporello is singing, basically the woman thinks that she is Don Giovanni's true love, and so Leporello sets her straight because he's got a catalog, he's got a book where he's written down every woman that Don Giovanni has ever slept with. And so he's singing to her about how Don Giovanni is all about just sleeping with as many women as he can. She, of course, gets very frustrated by this. It's a very, very famous aria. being sung by Leporello. Mozart's symphonies, he wrote 41 symphonies, considered to be some of the greatest symphonies ever written. We already listened to Symphony number 40 in G minor back in the previous unit. He wrote many piano concertos. We're not going to listen to one of his piano concertos. We've already listened to that. I am going to put in a link to the Dies Irae from Mozart's Requiem. It's really genius. It's an incredible piece of music. And if I can find it, I'm going to put in a video link. There's a movie about Mozart called Amadeus. Brilliant movie, won a bunch of Academy Awards back in the 80s when it came out. In the final scene of the movie, Mozart is dying in his bed and he's dictating his Requiem to his great rival, Antonio Salieri. So Mozart is singing the music to him and Salieri is trying to write it down. And the music that they're actually dictating in this scene is the Dies Irae. It's incredible, an incredible piece of music. The third of these great composers is Ludwig van Beethoven, who I think everyone has probably heard of. Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, the three greatest classical composers, and Mozart and Beethoven are considered to be maybe the greatest classical composers who have ever lived. He was born in 1770, was the youngest of the three, of course, died in 1827 at age 57. He was German. He was born into a family of musicians. His father was a singer who was an abusive alcoholic who used to beat Ludwig. He viewed Ludwig as potentially another Mozart, someone that could become famous and that he could make a lot of money off of. He had his first publications when he was 12, truly a musical genius. Had the same ability to conceive of music in his head as Mozart, but was even more creative and forward-thinking than Mozart. He basically created a whole new style of music by himself. He's the most influential composer who's ever lived. After Beethoven's death, pretty much everybody for the next 50 to 75 years was trying to be Beethoven. He went to Vienna, where Mozart heard him play and said, "Oh, you guys might want to check out this Beethoven kid. I think he's going to be something special." Then eventually came back to Vienna. Permanently, he studied some with Haydn as well as a couple other composers. He never worked for the wealthy or the church. He made his life entirely as a freelance musician. He was such a great musician and had such a force of personality that rich people gave him money. Several rich merchants in Vienna banded together and they paid Beethoven an annual salary just to stay in Vienna. He did not work for them. He was not responsible to them. They just wanted him to stay in Vienna because they were afraid if he moved to another city that Vienna would no longer be the capital of music. Taught lessons. He played publishers off against each other, negotiating the best deals for his music. So he did really well for a long time. Now, when he was 29 years old, he started to go deaf. This very famous thing about Beethoven is that he lost his hearing. He considered committing suicide, but ultimately resolved that he was going to continue to write music. Again, he had this ability to conceive of the music inside of his head. He didn't need to be able to hear to know what he wanted the music to sound like and know how to write it down. This kind of led to his whole emotional revolution and change of the way he was doing music. Before he started to go deaf, before 1800, his music was very similar to Haydn and Mozart in many ways. It was classical music. But then, in the 1800s, he started to write music that was more powerful, more emotional, more personal, and he basically invented the whole romantic musical movement. He believed very much that music was not just entertainment. He believed that music was art, and that he had something very profound to say. He put this all in his music. He would write, because he was a freelance musician, he could write whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. And if he wanted to take years to write something, he could. Whereas Haydn wrote 104 symphonies because the Esterházys wanted to have a new symphony for that weekend because their friends were coming over. Beethoven could spend 4 years working on a piece of music just to get it exactly like he wanted to get it. He used all of the same techniques and forms that the other composers were using. He just made it more powerful, more emotional, and more introspective. His music is all about tension. It's all about excitement. Sometimes it's incredibly sad. Sometimes it's incredibly heroic. He really takes a listener in all directions. He utilized the orchestra to play higher and lower and louder and softer than anyone had ever done before. He was also a composer who knew how he wanted it to sound. So he wrote everything into his music. All the dynamics, all the articulations, all the expressions, because he knew how he wanted it to sound, and he wanted the musicians to be able to do that. He wrote 9 symphonies. In his 9th symphony, written after he was completely deaf, he used vocal soloists and a choir. He was the first composer to do that, to write for voices in an instrumental symphony. It utilizes the Ode to Joy by a poet named Schiller, which is basically about brotherhood. He wrote 32 piano sonatas, 5 piano concertos, 16 string quartets, only 1 opera, 2 masses. Everything Beethoven wrote, just like most of what Mozart wrote, most of what Haydn wrote, is in the standard repertoire. If you're a piano player, then you know Beethoven piano sonatas and maybe his concertos. If you play in a string quartet, then you play string quartets. If you conduct an orchestra, then you know his 9 symphonies. They are the cornerstone of classical music, of Western art music. I'm going to link to 2 pieces of music for you. The first is the first movement of Beethoven's Sonata in C minor for piano, which has been nicknamed the Pathétique. Pathétique literally means with pathos, which means basically just emotional. Today we think of pathétique, pathetic, sad. Well, I mean, it does start a little sad, but then it gets very stormy. It's just a sonata that he wrote to really take advantage of all the emotional expression you could put into a piano at that time. So we're just going to listen to the first movement of that, and then we're going to listen to the first movement of Beethoven's Symphony No. 5. Beethoven's 5th Symphony is a landmark composition. He basically develops the entire piece out of 4 notes. It is a work of unbelievable genius. It's a piece I've played in orchestra multiple times in my career. And frankly, when I first started teaching Introduction to Music, I thought, oh great, Beethoven's 5th, that's boring, you know. I mean, it's so played, it's been heard so much. But when I first started teaching this class, and I really sat down and listened to this symphony again, I thought, wow, that really is brilliant beyond words. I mean, there's a reason why it is played so much, because it is that brilliant. I'm also going to put in a link to a documentary called Keeping Score. It's the conductor and members of the San Francisco Symphony. Basically, it's a 55-minute long documentary about Beethoven and about the creation of his 3rd Symphony, which was his landmark work. You don't have to watch it, but if you're interested, absolutely check it out, because it's amazing how he talks about the history of Beethoven and the creativity and the emotional trauma that Beethoven went through and came out the other side to write the rest of his symphonies. Okay, so this is the end of the classical period. Keep your eyes on Blackboard for forthcoming assignments.